Many of the top 50 barbecue restaurants use an industrial warming oven to hot hold their barbecue meats overnight above 140 degrees. But what about the rest of us? Can we achieve the same results at home with one of these coolers? Let's find out. I've heard it from many of the most popular barbecue YouTube channels that you can rest your meats in a cooler once they come off the smoker, and 1 or 2 hours later, you're good to go. But what if you want to replicate the deliciousness of what we see from the top Texas barbecue restaurants? According to all of the research that we can drum up, many of them are cooking their meats the day before and hot holding them overnight in a warming oven and then starting to serve them at lunch the next day. It's delicious and juicy barbecue meat that's rested above 140 degrees for 10 to 12 hours or even more. Now, I've heard mention that catering guys use this method when they're doing big cooks and that they're holding their barbecue in coolers and keeping it above the danger zone of 140 degrees overnight. Now, if you're not familiar with the food danger zone, the temperatures from 40 degrees to 140 degrees Fahrenheit is the zone at which bacteria can form, so food that is in this zone starts a countdown to when it needs to be eaten, chilled, or discarded. Now, caterers all over the United States are using Cambro style warmers to keep food warm and make it easier to transport barbecue from where it's cooked to where it's being served. Cambro is a brand name that's become synonymous with an insulated food transport container. So what we're testing today is if a cooler, which is an insulated container, can hold food overnight at a safe temperature. So here's the premise. Can we take the simple cooler that we use for resting our meats for a couple of hours and stretch that hold into an overnight hot hold that allows us to cook the day before and have it hold overnight to serve the next day and stay out of that danger zone? What about a Yeti cooler? This is the Tundra 45, and it's a significant step up from the party stacker that we showed you earlier. But the question is, can either of them achieve this goal? We're going to use pork shoulders since we're prepping them for a big pulled pork event where we feed 800 people. Now, this was shot during our practice cooks to nail down our timing, and we're going to test how well these coolers will hold the heat overnight when we pull them off the smoker. We wrapped them in aluminum foil when they hit about 160 degrees internal and pulled them off the smoker when they hit between 200 and 203 degrees internal temperature as measured by our ThermoWorks Signals thermometer. Once we wrapped up the pork, we filled our coolers with boiling water to heat up the walls and insulation of the cooler and then let it sit until the pork was done. Now, as soon as we pulled the pork butts off the pit, we opened up the foil to vent out the steam and let it continue to vent for 5 to 7 minutes. Now, while the steam was venting, we drained all of the hot water out of the coolers and quick dried them out so that they were ready to receive the pork. Now, after the 7-minute venting of the steam, we wrapped the pork back up in the foil. Now, once they were wrapped, each butt went into a cooler and we placed a probe into the middle of the pork and an air temp probe sitting on top of a towel in the cooler to monitor the air temperature as it dropped over time. We had hoped to hold the pork overnight and make it to the 12-hour hold mark, but here is how each cooler performed. The party stacker is up first, and you can tell by this graph that we put the pork shoulder into the cooler when it was registering 201.3 degrees internal at midnight Eastern Time. The internal temperature of the cooler at midnight was 91.4 degrees. The cooler was stored inside the house overnight, and it was set to 72 degrees inside. Now, we let the ThermoWorks Signals measure the temperature of the air and the meat, and the party stacker actually came up in temperature from 91.4 degrees all the way up to 105.4 degrees while the pork was inside holding hot. Now, the cooler warmed up most of the cook until the last half hour when it started to dip back down ever so slightly. Now, the pork had a steady fall in temperature from 201 all the way down to 140 degrees by 6:55 a.m., where we pulled the pork out of the cooler and vacuum sealed it to use at a later date, since I just wasn't feeling pulled pork at 7 a.m. that day. So the Party Stacker cooler held our pork at a food-safe temperature for just under 7 hours total. Now, not that bad for a cooler you can grab for around $50 or $60. Now it's Yeti's turn. This cooler is advertised as the bee's knees for keeping cold things cold, but according to their own website, it's also able to keep hot things hot. We took a hot pork butt and put it in the Yeti Tundra 45. The temperature of the pork butt had cooled quite a bit more by the time that we had finished getting the Party Stacker all set up, so the internal temperature of the pork was 193.1 degrees and the air temperature of the cooler had cooled to 84.5 degrees. Now you can see in the graph that the air temperature rose quite rapidly with the finished pork in the cooler, and it got all the way up to 142.9 degrees internal, which is much more than the 105.4 that we saw from the Party Stacker. Now we left the pork shoulder in the Yeti for exactly 12 and a half hours, and the internal temperature of the pork had only dropped to 144.1 degrees. And the air temperature was at 128.6 degrees after 12 and a half hours hot holding this pork. For those of you who are still with us and doing the math, the Yeti pork butt dropped from 193 to 144 over a period of 12 and a half hours. Now the Party Stacker pork butt dropped from 201 degrees to 140 degrees in 6 hours and 55 minutes. That's a 49-degree drop over 12 hours in the Yeti and a 61-degree drop in just under 7 hours for the Party Stacker. The winner? Well, Yeti absolutely outperformed the Party Stacker in this test, no question about it. So the question is, which cooler is right for you then? Now, if you're wanting to cook your barbecue meats the evening before and still get some sleep that night, the Yeti is the cooler that you want to have at your disposal. Now, if you're just wanting to hold your barbecue for an hour or two as a rest before company arrives, the Party Stacker will do just fine for that application. So if you're interested in the new Alpine Yellow Tundra 45 cooler, check out the link in the description below. I've also put a link where you can find the Party Stacker cooler and the ThermalWorks Signals thermometer as well. And if you click any of those links, you'll support our family of little barbecue nerds that love bringing you this kind of content. It doesn't cost you a dime extra, but it supports us and we feel the love. If you like this test, give us a thumbs up below, and if you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing. We'd love to meet you on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and all the socials, so give us a follow there where you can get to see all kinds of fun behind the scenes stuff before it makes it to the channel. I'm David, and I'll see you next time.